the village at the edge of forgetting crescent moon. There is a kind of place that exists only at the very edge of the world. Not the edge you can find on a map, not the edge marked by an ocean or a mountain range or a line drawn in ink by someone with a ruler and a serious expression. No, this is a different kind of edge altogether. It is the edge where the known world grows soft and quiet, where the roads thin out into footpaths, where the footpaths thin out into grass, and where the grass eventually gives way to a silence so complete, so deep, so gently absolute, that even the wind seems to move through it carefully, the way you might move through a room where someone beloved is sleeping. It is the kind of place that does not announce itself. You do not arrive there with a flourish. You simply find at some point that the noise of the world behind you has grown very distant, and the air around you has changed, cooler, slower, faintly sweet, with the smell of pine and damp earth, and something else, something harder to name, something that lives in the space between one breath and the next, and you realize, quietly, that you have been walking for some time without thinking about where you were going, and somehow, without meaning to, you have arrived somewhere that feels like the beginning of a dream. That is where Samnara was. It was a village so small and so tucked away that even people who lived in the nearby towns only a few hours' walk to the east, would sometimes furrow their brows when the name was mentioned, as if trying to remember a word in a language they had once known but had not spoken in years. Samnara, they would repeat slowly, tasting the syllables. Yes, yes, I believe I have heard of it. Somewhere past the Aldenmere forest, is it not? Past the old stone bridge with the moss, past the field where the lavender grows wild in summer, and the answer was always yes, past all of those things, and then a little further still, and then, when you thought surely there could be nothing more beyond the last curve of the path, there it was. A cluster of low stone houses with thick walls and deep windowsills. Gardens that seemed to grow without being overly managed, spilling softly over their edges like a conversation that had wandered happily off its original subject. A single unpaved main road, wide enough for a cart, but rarely used for one, lined on both sides by old oak trees whose branches had long ago grown toward each other and intertwined overhead, forming a canopy so dense and so green in summer that walking beneath it felt like walking through the inside of something living. Samnara had perhaps 40 houses, perhaps a few more, if you counted the outlying cottages that sat apart from the rest, separated by stretches of meadow or small stands of birch trees. It had a bakery, though bakery was perhaps too grand a word for what was really just the front room of a house where a woman named Sel had been making bread since before most of the current villagers were born. It had a mill, operated only a few days a week, and the miller, a broad, quiet man named Rand, was known to stop the wheel entirely if he spotted a family of ducks resting on the mill pond. It had a small square with a stone bench and a very old, very particular apple tree that produced fruit only in the most unpredictable years, and which the children had long since given up trying to climb, because its lowest branch was just high enough to be tantalizing, and just high enough to be impossible. It had, in other words, everything a village needs, and nothing a village doesn't. And for a very long time, for generations upon generations, for so many years that the counting of them had become more of a feeling than an actual number, it had been a happy place. Not happy in a loud, demonstrative way. Not a place of celebrations and festivals and grand occasions, though those happened too, in their quiet fashion, but happy in the way that a well-worn quilt is happy, or a favorite chair by a fire, or a cup of tea made exactly the way you like it, handed to you without your having to ask. Happy in the way of small things done with care and attention. Happy in the way of enough. But that was before the lake went dark, before the dreams stopped coming, before the mornings began to feel like something had been subtracted from them in the night, some essential ingredient removed so gradually that no one could quite say when it had disappeared or name precisely what was missing, only that the absence of it sat in the chest like a stone that was not quite heavy enough to be unbearable, but never quite light enough to be ignored. The lake was called Naluma, in the old language, the language that the eldest of the elders still remembered fragments of, the language that appeared in the carved inscriptions on the oldest buildings and the oldest gravestones. Naluma meant something that translated imperfectly into the modern tongue as the place where dreaming gathers, or perhaps the water that remembers what the waking world forgets. The translation was imperfect because the old word held both meanings simultaneously, and several others besides, all layered together the way colors are layered in deep water, each one visible and distinct, and yet inseparable from the whole. It lay to the west of the village, a 20-minute walk along a path that wound first through the oak canopy road, then through a small birchwood, then across a stretch of open meadow where in spring the grass grew so green and so fine it looked almost unreal, like the idea of grass rather than grass itself. The lake sat in a natural bowl of land, surrounded on 3 sides by gentle slopes covered in long reeds and soft rushes, and on the 4th side, the eastern side, nearest the village, by a wide, flat meadow that in summer filled with wildflowers of every color, and in winter lay smooth and pale beneath the snow like a page waiting to be written on. The lake was not large. You could walk its circumference in perhaps half an hour if you went slowly, which was the only appropriate pace for such a place. It was not grand or dramatic the way some lakes are, with cliffs plunging into black water and mist trailing dramatically off the surface at dawn. It was, or rather, it had been a gentle lake. A lake that invited you to sit beside it and breathe. A lake that seemed to listen when you spoke to it, and to answer not in words, but in the quiet movement of its surface, in the way the light shifted on the water, in the soft sound the reeds made when the breeze moved through them. A sound so close to a human voice, whispering, that more than one person, over the years, had turned their head at the sound, half expecting to find someone standing close behind them. The old people remembered it in full light. They remembered it the way you remember something from childhood that was so beautiful it has become almost more feeling than memory. Not a clear picture, but a warmth, a quality of light, a sensation in the body. They remembered walking to the lake as children, led by their own grandparents, and seeing it shine, not just reflecting the moon or the stars, though it did that too with extraordinary faithfulness. So clear and still was its surface on calm nights, but shining from within. A light that rose from the depths and spread across the water like the quietest dawn imaginable, blue at first, deep and oceanic, and then slowly shifting to silver. And then, on the most special nights, to a gold so soft and warm it made you feel as if you were being held. The light never hurt the eyes. It never startled or alarmed. It was not the kind of light that demands your attention. It was the kind of light that earns it. Slowly, gently, the way trust is earned, the way real rest is earned at the end of a long and honest day. And when the lake shone, the people of Samnara dreamed, not only in the obvious sense, not only that their sleep was deeper and more restful when the lake was bright, though it was. The dreaming that Naluma brought was something richer and stranger, and more nourishing than ordinary dreaming. It was as if the lake kept, in its luminous depths, all the dreams that had ever been dreamed beside its shore, all the visions and wanderings and night stories of every villager who had ever lived in Samnara across all the long years of the village's existence. And in the night hours, it would release these carefully, the way a garden releases its scent on a warm evening, slowly and without hurry, letting each sleeper receive what they needed most. A child who was frightened would dream of a familiar place where nothing could harm them. An old man grieving someone lost would dream of that person again, alive and laughing, speaking in their old familiar voice. A young woman uncertain about her path would dream of walking through a landscape so beautiful and so right that she would wake in the morning with something clarified in her chest, some quiet certainty that had not been there the night before. A tired farmer would dream of rest so complete and so held that he would rise before dawn feeling, against all expectation, restored. The lake gave to each sleeper what they needed, and asked for nothing in return except that they come to it, sometimes in their waking hours, that they sit at its edge in the early morning or the late evening and be still, that they breathe, that they look at the water without trying to see anything in particular, without agenda or urgency, and simply allow themselves to be present beside something ancient and patient and alive. It was not a demanding request. It was, if anything, the most generous of arrangements, to be given such gifts in exchange for nothing more than a little stillness, a little willingness to rest. And for a long time, the people of Samnara had honored it instinctively, without being told to, without it even occurring to them that it required honoring. They had walked to the lake the way they walked to the well for water, or to the bakery for bread, naturally, without occasion, as part of the ordinary texture of their days. The children ran ahead on the path. The old people walked slowly and said little. The lake received everyone without preference or distinction, and shone for all of them equally. But things change. Things always change, not always with warning, and not always with ceremony, and sometimes not until long after the changing has already happened does anyone think to look back and mark the moment when it began. It was impossible to say exactly when the people of Samnara had stopped going to the lake. It had happened the way these things happen, not all at once, not with any particular decision or dramatic turning away, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, over the course of years. A particularly busy harvest season during which nobody could spare the time for an evening walk. A long winter when the path became difficult and the meadow was dark and cold and uninviting. A generation of children who grew up watching their parents be busy, and who learned from that watching that busyness was the natural and correct state of a person, and that stillness was something you fell into by accident rather than chose on purpose. And then, because these things are always circular, always self-reinforcing, as the visits to the lake grew fewer, the dreams grew thinner, and as the dreams grew thinner, the people of Samnara grew more restless in their days, less able to be still, less inclined to take a slow evening walk to a quiet lake for no particular reason, less able to justify to themselves the taking of time that had no product, no outcome, no measurable result. And so the visits grew fewer still, and the dreams grew thinner still. And one morning, without announcement, the lake had simply gone dark. Not ugly. It had not become a bad place. There was nothing menacing or unhappy about it now. It was simply still, quiet in a different way than before, a silence that was not peaceful but empty, not calm but absent. The reeds still grew. The wildflowers still appeared in summer. The water was still clear when you looked down into it in daylight, but the light from within was gone, and with it, the particular quality of presence. The lake had always had that sense, indefinable but unmistakable, that something was there, something patient and aware, attending. Without the lake's dreaming, the people of Samnara slept, but did not rest. Their nights were not troubled, exactly, not full of nightmares or disturbances. They were simply hollow. They would lie down tired and rise tired, and the hours between were a blankness, a gap in their experience of themselves, a crossing from one shore to another without any memory of the journey. It was as if sleep had become merely a mechanical necessity, a thing the body did in order to continue functioning, stripped of every quality that had ever made it feel like a gift. The elders recognized what had happened, or something close to it. They would speak of it sometimes in low voices in the evenings, gathered at the stone bench in the square, or in one another's kitchens over cups of something warm. They spoke of the lake as one speaks of someone who has gone away, with a mixture of loss and longing, and a certain guilt that no one quite voiced directly, but that everyone present could feel, like a draft from a window that nobody moved to close. The younger villagers, those who had grown up after the lake went dark, or who had been very small when it happened, understood less and felt more. They felt it as a vague and sourceless dissatisfaction, a sense that something was missing from their lives without knowing what it was or where it had gone. They were not unhappy, not in any way they could name or point to. They had their work and their families and their ordinary pleasures, but there was a flatness to things, a muted quality, as if the world had been turned down slightly in volume and color and warmth, as if life were being experienced through gauze. The children, at least the older children, those who had grown past the age of pure immediacy and begun to develop the capacity for noticing the texture of their own experience, would sometimes look at their parents and grandparents and feel, without being able to articulate it, that the adults around them were perpetually tired in a way that sleep did not fix. There was something in the eyes of the grown-ups of Samnara, not sadness, not quite, but a particular quality of absence, as if a small but essential light behind the eyes had been turned down to its lowest setting, and the village itself, while still beautiful and still cared for, had taken on a subtly different character. Things were maintained, but not embellished. Gardens were tended, but not added to. The old stories were told, but told shorter, told faster, with fewer digressions and wanderings than they had once contained. The music that had always been part of village life, the informal playing on summer evenings, the singing that had once accompanied nearly every kind of shared work, had not disappeared entirely, but it rose up less often, with with less ease, as if everyone was a little too tired to begin, and a little too uncertain to be the first. This was Samnara as it was now, a village still worth loving, still home to good and decent people who looked after one another and kept their word and grew their food and raised their children with care and attention. A village that anyone arriving from outside might have looked at and found entirely charming, but a village that had lost, quietly and without drama, something that had always been at its center, some quality of aliveness, some access to depth, some capacity for the particular kind of rest that restores not only the body, but the soul. And into this village, into this particular quietness, and this particular longing, a child had been born 12 years before the story's beginning, in the middle of the night, in the house closest to the old oak trees, with the sound of the wind moving through the branches above, and the whole dark sky spread out through the window like a gift. Her parents had called her Leora, which in the old language meant one who is held by the light. And if they had paused to wonder, in the year of her birth, how they had remembered that old word and why it had seemed so exactly right, they might have found no satisfying answer. Some names arrive already knowing the person they are meant for. From the very beginning, Leora was different in a way that was difficult to describe and impossible to overlook. Not different in any way that caused concern or required explanation. She was healthy, cheerful, curious, affectionate, fond of climbing things. She was not supposed to climb and asking questions at hours when questions were not particularly welcome. She was, in all the ordinary senses, a perfectly ordinary child, but she dreamed, while everyone else in Samnara moved through their nights in that hollow, restless blankness. Leora dreamed with extraordinary richness and frequency and clarity. She had always dreamed this way from the very beginning of her life, and it had never occurred to her that this was unusual, because she had no experience of anything else. Sleep for her was a country she visited every night, vast and various and endlessly inventive, sometimes strange, sometimes frightening in the way that is also exciting, but always vivid, always present, always alive in a way that made returning from it each morning feel like emerging from somewhere very real. And among all her dreams, one recurred more than the others. In the dream, she stood at the edge of a lake. The lake was dark at first, always dark when the dream began, and she stood at its edge in the night air with the grass cold and soft under her bare feet and the sky above her full of stars. And she waited in the dream the way she somehow always knew to wait, not anxiously, not impatiently, but with an openness in her chest that was almost like hunger, but warmer, more patient, more willing. And then the light would begin. From the deepest part of the water, from somewhere far below the surface, a glow would rise slow and soft and unmistakable, blue at first, and then silver, and then gold, spreading outward like a breath being released after a long, long time held. And the light would reach the shore and reach her feet and move up through her, the way warmth moves through a cold body gradually from the outside in, until she was standing in the middle of it, and the middle of it was everywhere. And there was nothing in her that was not, in that moment, completely and entirely at peace. She had never told anyone about this dream, except one person, her grandmother, old Marin, who sat by the fire in the evenings with her shawl around her shoulders and her eyes that were the color of river water in autumn, and who listened to Leora's descriptions of the lake and the light with an expression of such careful, quiet attention that it felt like being truly heard for the first time, every time. "That is Naluma," old Marin had said once, her voice very low, as if speaking of something sacred, which she was. "That is our lake, my love, as it was." "As it was," Leora had repeated. "But it's not like that now." "No," old Marin had agreed, looking for a long moment into the fire. "Not now, not yet." And then she had looked up, and her eyes had been very bright, and she had said, "But the lake has not forgotten us. It has only gone quiet, and things that go quiet are not the same as things that are gone." Leora had held those words inside her, like a small, warm lamp carried through a very dark house. The lake has not forgotten us. She would think of them on the mornings when the night had been particularly rich with dreaming. And she woke to find the rest of the household moving through the early hours with that particular look in their eyes, that muted, unrested look. And she would feel the contrast between her own interior and theirs as a kind of ache, a longing to share what she had, to give it, to find some way to bring back what had clearly once been there, and could, she was certain, be there again. She did not know how. She was 12 years old, and she lived in a small village at the edge of the world, and the tools available to her were patience and love, and a faith she had not chosen so much as simply found inside herself, the way you find a river stone in your pocket that you do not remember picking up, but she was beginning to understand, in the particular way that children understand things before they have the language for the understanding, in the body, in the gut, in the quiet place behind the sternum, where truth settles before the mind catches up, that something was coming, or that she was coming towards something, that the recurring dream of the glowing lake was not merely a dream, but an invitation, and that the time for accepting it was drawing close. The moon outside her window on this particular evening was round and heavy and low in the sky, the color of old honey, impossibly large, the kind of moon that seemed to exist for the specific purpose of making the world feel both infinitely large and entirely intimate. Leora stood at her window and looked at it for a long moment. Then she turned from the window and moved quietly through the house and found her soft wool blanket on the chair by the door and wrapped it around her shoulders, and she began to walk. The lake was waiting. It had always been waiting, and some part of Leora, deeper than thought and older than memory, had always known she would come. The girl who still believed, the path from the village to the lake, was one of those paths that seemed to change its character depending on the hour at which you walked it. In the morning, it was bright and practical, a useful connection between 2 points, dappled with early light, busy with bird song, smelling of dew and fresh earth, and the particular greenness of things that have just been rained on, or are still holding the memory of last night's moisture in their leaves. In the morning, the path was cheerful and obliging, and you walked it quickly, purposefully, with somewhere to be at the end of it. In the afternoon, it was companionable. The light came through the oak canopy at a lower angle, warmer and more golden, and the shadows were longer and more interesting, and the sounds of the forest had settled into their midday ease, less urgent than morning, less mysterious than evening, simply present and pleasant and unhurried. You walked this path in the afternoon with a loose gait and a mind that was allowed to wander, and the path seemed to encourage the wandering, the way a good friend encourages you to keep talking even when you have lost the thread of what you were saying, because the talking itself is the point. But at night, the path was something else entirely. At night, it became a passage, not in any frightening sense. There was nothing threatening about this path at night, nothing that made the hair rise or the heart quicken with alarm. The village of Samnara had never been a place of dangers, and the forest around it had always been the kind of forest that shelters rather than menaces, the kind that closes around you like cupped hands rather than swallowing you. At night, the path asked only that you slow down and pay attention and allow the experience of moving through it to be different from what it was in daylight. Leora had walked this path at night before, not often and never alone, but enough to know its nighttime character. She knew that the oak canopy overhead, which in daylight filtered the sunlight into shifting green-gold patterns, became at night a kind of cathedral, the branches lifting high and dark against the sky, the spaces between them showing stars in irregular and somehow more beautiful configurations than the open sky showed, as if the trees had edited the sky into something more carefully composed. She knew that the sounds were different at night. The daytime birds replaced by different voices, owls and nightjars, and small nocturnal rustlings in the undergrowth that were entirely ordinary and entirely unthreatening. which gave the air a quality of inhabited mystery, a sense that the world was full of lives being quietly lived in the dark, just beyond the reach of sight. She had always found this comforting rather than alarming. The knowledge of invisible lives, the sense of being surrounded by things that did not require her awareness in order to go on being themselves. She walked now with the moon to her right, its heavy honey light falling sideways through the trees and laying itself along the path in long, pale bands. Her blanket was around her shoulders, soft and familiar, smelling of the cedar chest where it lived, folded at the foot of her bed. Her feet were in her old boots, the ones with the scuffed toes, and the laces that had been retied so many times in different configurations that they no longer sat quite evenly, and the familiar weight and shape of them on her feet was a small comfort, an anchor in the body, while the mind and the heart were moving forward into something unknown. She was not afraid. She examined this fact as she walked, turning it over with the same careful attention she gave to interesting stones she found in streams or unusual words she encountered in books. She ought, perhaps, to have been at least a little afraid, or so the logical part of her suggested. She was 12 years old and walking alone through a forest at night toward a lake that had been dark and silent for longer than she had been alive, following the pull of a recurring dream toward she did not know exactly what. A case could certainly be made for caution. A case could certainly be made for going back to bed, but the fear simply was not there. In its place was something she did not have a precise word for, a feeling that combined certainty and openness in equal measure, as if she knew exactly where she was going and was simultaneously completely willing to be surprised by what she found there. It felt like the feeling of walking into a room where someone you love has been, and being able to tell, from the warmth and the particular quality of the air, that they have only just left and might, if you are attentive and patient, return. The birchwood came after the oaks, a stand of perhaps 50 trees, slim and white-barked, their leaves catching the moonlight and turning it into a pale, flickering silver that fell through the branches like very slow water. The birches were the most dreamlike part of the walk. They always had been. Something about their slenderness, their whiteness, their tendency to tremble at the slightest breath of wind, made them seem less like solid things than like suggestions of things. The idea of trees rather than trees themselves, sketched in silver on the night air. Leora moved through them slowly, her hand trailing along one smooth trunk and then another. The bark was cool under her fingers, faintly rough in the places where it had begun to peel away in its natural papery layers. She had always loved birch trees. They seemed to her to be trees, that understood impermanence, that wore their own changing as an ornament rather than a wound, peeling away their outer layers with a kind of ease and grace that suggested they knew something the rest of the world was still trying to learn. Beyond the birchwood, the trees gave way abruptly, as they always did, to the open meadow, and the meadow at night was a country she had visited in dreams, but not often enough in waking life, and the sight of it now, opening before her as the last birch tree stepped aside, made her stop for a moment and simply breathe. The meadow at night in full moonlight was vast and silver and perfectly, absolutely still. The long grass, which in daylight was green and various and alive with small movements, was at this hour a single silver surface, gently luminous, moving in one slow, unified breath, as the faintest possible breeze passed through it from west to east. The wild flowers that were beginning to open with the early approach of spring were small, pale shapes among the silver grass, their colors indistinguishable in the moonlight, but their presence felt a sweetness in the air, a faint warmth of scent that the night had concentrated and refined into something more delicate than its daytime version. Above the meadow, the sky was enormous. Leora always forgot, between one visit and the next, how enormous the sky was above the meadow. In the village, the sky was divided and framed by rooftops and treetops, and the familiar shapes of things. In the birchwood, the trees held the sky at a manageable distance, but here in the open, the sky became its full and staggering self, an immensity of deep blue-black scattered with more stars than seemed reasonable, layered in depths that made her feel, when she looked up at it too directly, a pleasant vertigo, a sense of her own smallness that was not diminishing, but somehow enlarging, as if being small inside something vast was its own kind of spaciousness. She stood at the meadow's edge for a long moment, looking up. Then she looked forward across the silver grass to the far edge where the meadow ended and the gentle slopes of the lake's bowl began. She could not see the lake from here. It lay below the level of the meadow, cradled in its hollow, but she could feel the direction of it. She had always been able to feel the direction of it, the way you can feel the direction of water in dry country, a subtle orientation in the body, a leaning toward. She walked through the meadow slowly, the grass brushing against her knees, the dew already beginning to gather on its tips, and transferring in tiny cold points of contact to her skin, her boots, the hem of her nightgown below the blanket's edge. The wetness was not unpleasant. It was the body being reminded that it was real and present and here, exactly here, in this meadow, at this hour, in this particular night that would not come again. She had been thinking, as she walked, about old Marin's words. She thought about them often, but tonight they had a different weight, a different texture, as if the walk itself was pressing meaning into them that had always been there, but had not yet been fully released. The lake has not forgotten us. It is only waiting, and things that go quiet are not the same as things that are gone. Leora had turned these words over in her mind so many times across the years that she could have recited them in her sleep, and perhaps had, she thought with a small smile. Perhaps that was where they had done most of their work, in the sleeping hours, quietly rearranging something in her understanding like furniture, moved slightly in a room so that the space works better, even if you cannot immediately say what has changed. Old Marin was the person Leora loved most in the world. This was not a competitive love. She did not love her grandmother more than she loved her parents, or her younger brother Tio, or the family's old gray cat, who slept in improbable positions by the kitchen fire. Love was not a competition, and Leora had always known this in the way that some children simply know things that others have to be taught. But her love for old Marin had a particular quality that her other loves did not, a quality of recognition, as if in her grandmother she had found not only a person to love, but a mirror of something in herself, some way of being in the world that she had not yet fully grown into, but could see in old Marin's life like a path that had already been walked and was waiting for her feet. Old Marin had been a girl in Samnara when the lake still shone. She was the last living person in the village who could remember it from childhood, who had walked this same path, through these same trees, across this same meadow, as a small girl led by her own grandmother's hand, and had arrived at the lake's edge to find it glowing. She remembered it the way Leora remembered the dream, not as a picture, but as a feeling, a quality of presence, a warmth in the chest that the years had not dimmed, and that she could still access when she closed her eyes and was still, with what seemed to Leora like extraordinary ease. Old Marin had, in her long life, developed a relationship with stillness that Leora watched with something close to reverence. It was not the stillness of passivity, not the stillness of someone who had simply stopped moving through the world and sat down in one place to wait for the end. It was an active stillness, an attentive stillness, the stillness of someone who had learned, through long practice, that the most important things arrive quietly and are easily missed by people in motion. She had learned to create, around herself, a quality of quiet that other people felt when they entered her presence, and that they could not always explain, but that they sought without always knowing why. The way a cold person seeks a warm room without necessarily understanding the physics of heat. When Leora was very small, 4 or 5 years old, she had asked old Marin once why she was always so still, Old Marin had considered the question with the same seriousness she gave to all of Leora's questions, which was one of the things Leora loved most about her. This refusal to treat a child's curiosity as anything less than real curiosity, deserving a real answer. "I am not always still," old Marin had said finally, "but I try to remember to be still often enough. Because the world," she had continued, leaning slightly forward, her voice dropping to the register she used for things that mattered, "the world speaks very quietly. It has a great deal to say, and it says most of it in a whisper. And if you are always making noise, even good noise, even necessary noise, you miss the whisper. And the whisper is usually the most important part." Leora had carried that too. She had a gift for carrying things that mattered, for finding the sentences and moments and images that held something essential, and tucking them somewhere safe inside herself, where they continued to work long after the conscious mind had moved on to other things. She had thought about the whisper often across the years. She had thought about what the world might be trying to say to her and to the village in its quiet, persistent voice. She had thought about what it might mean to be still enough to hear it, and she had thought about the lake. The lake had always been the center of her thinking about these things, the way a lamp is the center of the room it illuminates, even when you are not looking directly at it. She could not have told you why she was so certain, with the deep, unshakable, bodily certainty that bypassed argument and lived below the level of persuasion, that the lake was the key, not the only thing that needed attention, not the only place where something had been lost, but the source, the center, the place from which everything else had once radiated outward, and to which, somehow, everything would need to return. She had never said this to anyone except old Marin. She had tried once to say something close to it to her mother, a careful, circling attempt to describe the feeling she had about the lake and about the dreams and about the hollowness she saw in the adults around her that she believed with her whole small, certain heart, did not have to be permanent. Her mother had listened with a face that was trying to be open and had mostly succeeded. But there had been a moment, a brief, involuntary moment, when something behind her eyes had shifted in a way that Leora recognized as the expression adults wore when they were trying to take seriously something they did not quite believe in, and the effort of the trying was visible. It had not hurt. It had simply clarified something for her, that this was not yet a thing for the open air. It was not yet ready to be spoken in ordinary daylight sentences to people who were tired and practical and had forgotten what they did not know they had forgotten. It was, for now, a thing for old Marin's fireside and her own sleeping hours, and the long interior conversations she had with herself on walks, and in the bath, and in the particular useful vacancy of doing simple, repetitive tasks. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the certainty that had always been a background presence, steady and quiet, like a light left on in a room at the end of a hall, had moved to the foreground. Tonight, it had weight and direction and urgency of a kind that was not frantic, but was insistent. A hand on her shoulder, a gentle and unhurried and entirely irresistible pressure forward. She had reached the far edge of the meadow now, where the ground began to slope downward, and she paused at the top of the slope and looked down. The lake was below her, dark as she had known it would be, perfectly still. The reeds around its edges stood silver gray in the moonlight, their reflections lying in the black water with extraordinary precision, each reed repeated exactly below the surface, as if the water were keeping a record. The wildflower meadow to the east, her meadow, the one she had just crossed, ended here at a small flat bank of earth and grass. And it was there, at that bank, at the very edge where land met water, that she felt herself being drawn. She descended the slope carefully, the damp grass slippery under her boots, her hand reaching out once to a convenient boulder that had always sat halfway down the slope, as if placed there specifically for this purpose. At the bottom, she walked the last few meters to the water's edge and stood there, looking at the lake. It was quiet, not the busy quiet of a forest at night, full of small sounds and subtle movements, but a deep, settled quiet, the quiet of something that has been waiting for a very long time and has made its peace with the waiting. The water was completely still. Not a ripple, not a movement, not even the suggestion of movement. It lay there dark and smooth and patient, holding its own reflection of the moon in its exact center, like a cupped hand holds something precious. Leora removed her boots. She did this slowly and deliberately, setting them side by side on the grass behind her, with a care that felt ceremonial, though she could not have said why. The grass under her bare feet was cold, cold and dense, and slightly wet with dew, and the sensation moved up through the soles of her feet and her ankles and her calves with a clarity that made her suddenly, sharply, completely present. Not in a startling way, in the way of being gathered, of all the scattered parts of oneself returning from wherever they had been and settling back into the body, which was here, which was real, which was standing on cold grass at the edge of a dark lake under a honey-colored moon. She sat down. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and folded her legs beneath her and placed her hands in her lap, palms upward, not deliberately, not as a gesture she had decided on, but because they went there on their own, the way the body sometimes knows the right position before the mind has thought of it. And she looked at the lake. She did not look for anything. She did not hope for a specific thing to happen at a specific moment, in a specific way. She simply looked, with the quality of attention she had learned from old Marin, and from the dreams, and from all the long hours of interior conversation with herself. An attention that was open and patient and genuinely, deeply curious, but that had released all requirement for the curiosity to be satisfied on any particular timetable. The air was very still. The reeds made no sound. The moon continued its slow, imperceptible movement across the sky, drawing its reflection across the water's surface with the unhurried certainty of something that has all the time in the world, because it is not subject to time in the way that other things are. Leora breathed in and out, slow and even. The cold air moved through her and became warm and moved back out again, and each breath was a small complete thing, a beginning and a middle and an end and a beginning again. She felt her shoulders drop with the third breath. She felt the slight tension behind her eyes, the tension she had not known was there, until it was gone, release with the fifth. She felt her hands, still lying open in her lap, grow heavy and warm despite the cool night, as if something was flowing into them from the direction of the water. She sat like that for a long time. The moon moved. The stars turned their slow, imperceptible turning. The reeds stood still and silver and patient, and Leora sat at the edge of Naluma, breathing, waiting, being present with the depth of presence that very few people manage, because very few people allow themselves to want nothing even for a moment. And she felt, very quietly, very gradually, like the first color of dawn appearing at the edge of a completely dark sky. Something beginning, not yet visible, not yet nameable, but there, unmistakably there, in the water and in the air, and in the space between one breath and the next. A quality of gathering, of accumulation, as if the night itself were slowly, carefully, deliberately leaning in. She did not move. She did not speak. She only breathed and waited and believed, with the whole quiet force of 12 years of dreaming and listening and carrying the things that mattered, that the lake had not forgotten, that it was only waiting, that things which go quiet are not the same as things which are gone, and somewhere in the deep black water, something that had been still for a very long time began, almost imperceptibly, to stir. She could not see it yet, but she could feel it, the way you feel a presence in a room before you have turned to look, the way you feel the sun before it clears the horizon, the way you feel in the last moment before sleep that you are being gently, carefully, lovingly received. It was beginning, and Leora, sitting still at the edge of the dark water with her blanket around her shoulders, and her hands open in her lap, and her eyes soft and patient and unafraid, was exactly, precisely, perfectly ready the shore of still water droplet. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only at the edge of water. It is not the silence of an empty room, which is merely the absence of sound and carries with it the faint anxiety of vacancy, the sense that something ought to be filling the space and is not. It is not the silence of a library or a place of worship, which is a held silence, a silence maintained by collective effort and mutual agreement, a silence that is always slightly aware of itself and of the possibility of being broken. It is not even the silence of deep countryside on a still night, which is beautiful and restoring, but is also a silence full of small sounds, the breathing of grass, the distant bark of a dog, the imperceptible but present hum of the living world going about its business. The silence at the edge of still water is different from all of these. It is a silence that includes you. That is the only way Leora had ever been able to think of it, in the private language she used for experiences that resisted ordinary description. Other silences asked you to be silent too, to hold yourself still and careful so as not to disturb them. But the silence at the water's edge did something else. It extended itself outward gently, like an arm offered in welcome, and it drew you into itself. And once you were inside it, you were not a disturbance of the silence, but a part of it. Your breathing became part of it. Your heartbeat became part of it. The small shift of your weight on the grass, the blink of your eyes, the infinitesimal sound of your own thoughts. All of it folded into the silence and became silence, the way a river becomes the sea not by stopping, but by arriving. She had been sitting at the water's edge for what felt like a very long time, though she could not have said with any confidence whether it had been 20 minutes or 2 hours. Time at the lake's edge had always behaved differently than time elsewhere, not faster or slower exactly, but less insistent, less linear, more like weather than like clock hands, more like a quality of atmosphere than a measurable quantity of minutes. The moon had moved. She could tell that much. When she had first sat down, it had been almost directly overhead, round and heavy and close, that enormous honey-colored presence that had accompanied her all the way from the village. Now it had shifted westward, and its light came in at a different angle, and the shadows of the reeds on the water had changed their orientation by perhaps 30 degrees. So some time had passed, an hour maybe, perhaps more, but she had not grown restless. This, she reflected, was perhaps the thing that surprised her most about herself tonight. She was 12 years old, which was an age at which the body had strong opinions about sitting still, and those opinions were generally not positive ones. She was an active person, fond of walking and climbing, and the particular satisfaction of physical work that produced a visible result. And extended stillness had never been something that came to her without effort in ordinary circumstances. Sitting for an hour in the dark by a silent lake would have been a small and private struggle, requiring the continuous mild application of will. But tonight there was no struggle. Tonight the stillness was not something she was imposing on herself, but something she had fallen into, the way you fall into a conversation that interests you so completely that time and physical discomfort become irrelevant. She was not enduring the stillness. She was living inside it, and the living inside it had a quality of attention and aliveness that was more, not less, than anything she would have experienced in motion. She was watching the water, not staring at it, not studying it with the focused, intent gaze of someone looking for something specific, but watching it the way you watch a fire, with a soft, diffuse, unhurried attention that is both fully present and fully relaxed, an attention that takes in everything without gripping anything, that remains open to whatever the watched thing wishes to offer without demanding that it offer anything at all. The water was very dark. In the moonlight, it was not black exactly, but a very deep blue-gray, the color of the sky in the last minutes before full night, when the last trace of blue is still present, but barely. It was clear. She could see in the shallower areas near the bank the dark shapes of pebbles and water plants resting on the bottom, with the slightly unreal clarity of things seen through an exceptionally transparent medium. The water held no sediment, no murkiness, no disturbance. It was simply itself, completely. The reeds at the margins of the lake were still. This was the thing that kept drawing her attention, the thing that struck her as extraordinary in a way she could not entirely account for. It was a still night. Yes, barely any wind, barely any movement in the air at all. But even on still nights, reeds moved. They were so sensitive to air movement, so responsive to the smallest eddy or breath, that they were almost always in some degree of motion, their tips tracing slow, continuous, infinitely variable patterns against whatever was behind them. Tonight, they were completely motionless, not suppressed, not held, simply still, as if they too had decided, for this particular night and this particular hour, to participate in whatever was gathering at the water's edge. Everything was waiting. Leora felt this not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a quality of suspended attention in the air around her, as if the meadow and the reeds and the dark water and the watching moon were all, in their various ways, turned toward this moment with the patient, unhurried concentration of things that have been waiting for a long time and have learned, in the waiting, to wait without impatience. She breathed. The air that came into her was cool and clean, and faintly scented with water and reeds and the green growing things at the lake's margin. She held it for a moment, not deliberately, not as a technique, but simply because her body did not seem to be in a hurry to release it, and then let it go slowly, completely, all the way to the bottom of the breath, way old Marin had once shown her. Not just the top breath, not just the easy breath, but all the way down past the chest and into the belly, all the way to the floor of the breath where everything was very quiet. With the exhalation, something released in her that she had not known was held. It was not tension exactly, or not only tension. It was something more like the accumulated weight of ordinary time, the weight of days that had been lived forward through their hours, with the usual degree of effort and attention and care. The small and large concerns that accompanied a person through a day, the unfinished things, the things said and not said, the things wanted and not yet had, the things worried about and not yet resolved. All of that, she felt, went out with the breath, quietly and without drama, like sand running out of a cupped hand. Not gone forever, not resolved, but set down for now, placed gently on the grass beside her, where it would wait patiently until morning without requiring anything of her in the meantime. She felt lighter, not in a dramatic, revelatory way, not like a sudden transformation, not like the lifting of a weight that had been crushing, more like the gentle subtraction of something she had been carrying so long and so habitually that she had forgotten she was carrying it until the moment it was no longer there. And in its absence, she could feel, for the first time in a while, her actual self. What she was when she was not also being the holder of all the small accumulated things. She was, she discovered, very peaceful. This was not a thought she had about herself. It was an observation made with the same mild curiosity with which she might observe that the reeds were still or that the moon had moved. Simply a noticing, this is what is here. This is what this moment contains. Peacefulness, not manufactured, not maintained by effort, not dependent on any particular thing continuing to be the case. Just present, the way the water was present, the way the night was present, as a simple, quiet, foundational fact. She did not know how much time passed in that state. She knew that at some point the moon completed its westward movement and began to descend toward the tree line on the far side of the lake, and that its light on the water changed quality as it descended, becoming less overhead and more horizontal, so that the light lay across the surface rather than falling into it, and the water became a mirror of a different kind, reflecting not the sky above, but the far bank and the low hills, and the beginning of the trees in a long, dark, horizontal image that had the strange, compressed beauty of a reflection that shows you a world at once entirely familiar and slightly improved by the act of being reflected. She knew that at some point an owl called somewhere in the birchwood behind her. One long, low, considered note, and then silence, and then one more, as if it were making a statement, and then deciding the statement was complete. She knew that at some point she became aware of a change in the air, not a temperature change, not a pressure change, nothing that she could have described in physical terms, but a change nonetheless. A shift in the quality of the darkness. A gathering of something in the atmosphere that had not been there before, or had been there in potential, and was now beginning to be there in fact. She did not move. She did not speak. She only became, if possible, a little more still. The way an animal becomes still when it senses something approaching, not with fear, but with the heightened, whole-body attentiveness of a creature that trusts its own perceptions and is willing to let the approaching thing take its time. And then she saw it, or rather, she began to see it, because it did not appear all at once. It did not switch on. It was not a sudden revelation or a dramatic emergence. It was, instead, the most gradual thing she had ever witnessed. A process so slow that she was not entirely sure, in the first moments of it, whether she was seeing something real or whether her eyes, grown accustomed to the specific darkness of this particular night, were simply adjusting and finding light where there had always been light. Light she had merely failed to register before. It began at the center of the lake, at the very deepest point, as far from the shore in every direction as the lake's geography allowed. That point, which in the daytime was distinguishable from the rest of the water only by the fact that you could not see the bottom there, could not see anything below the surface except depth, an implication of depth, a darkness that went down further than the eye could follow. At that point, something began. A quality, a suggestion. The water there was still dark, but the darkness had changed. Where before it had been the flat, opaque darkness of a surface that simply absorbed light and gave nothing back, now there was something else present. Something that was not yet light, but was, perhaps, the memory of light, or the intention of it, or the very earliest stage of a process that would eventually, if given time and attention and the right conditions, become light. It was the color of the deepest part of the ocean in photographs taken from very high above. That blue so deep it is almost black. That blue which exists at the boundary between color and the absence of color. That blue which seems to belong to a register of experience that ordinary waking life rarely touches. Leora stared at it. Her heart, she noticed, had not quickened. This surprised her in the small observational corner of her mind that was still monitoring such things. She had expected, if this moment ever came, and she had always believed it would come, had built the believing into her interior architecture the way you build load-bearing walls, essential and not decorative. She had expected to feel excitement, even elation, a rushing forward of the heart toward the thing it had been waiting for. But what she felt was different, deeper and quieter, and in some ways more affecting than excitement. What she felt was recognition, the kind of recognition that does not surprise, the kind that simply confirms, that takes the thing you always suspected was true and places it gently in front of you and says, yes, you were right. It was always there. You were right to believe. The glow at the center of the lake deepened. Blue that was almost black became unmistakably blue. A true blue now, a living blue, the blue of deep water when light moves through it, the blue of certain winter skis at the very apex of their height, the blue of a flame at its coolest and also its most essential point. It spread from the center outward, moving across the water's surface, not in a rush, but in the manner of something that has all the time it needs, a slow, deliberate, patient expansion, like a breath taken deeply and released in its own time. The reeds, still motionless, caught the first edge of the blue light and held it in their pale stalks like a secret. The reflection of the far bank in the water's surface was replaced, gradually, by the reflection of the glow. And because the glow came from below the surface rather than above it, the reflection was not a reflection at all, but the thing itself, the light passing up through the water and emerging at the surface and continuing upward into the night air softly, without drama, without demand. Leora felt it when it reached her, the light spreading from the center of the lake toward the shore, arrived at the edge of the water where the bank met the surface. And then it was in the shallow water at her feet. She could see it, could see the pebbles and the water plants illuminated now from below with that extraordinary blue. And then it was beyond the water's edge, in the air, and she felt it on her skin. It was warm. She had not expected that. She had expected light, and she had expected, because she had seen it in the dream, always approaching, spreading. She had expected the visual experience of it, the seeing. She had not expected to feel it on her skin as warmth. A warmth like sunlight, but softer, without the directional quality of sunlight, without the sense of a point source projecting outward. This warmth came from everywhere at once, or from no particular direction, the way warmth comes from a room where a fire has been burning for many hours. Present in the walls, in the floor, in the air itself, not concentrated anywhere, but distributed with extraordinary evenness throughout the entire space. She looked down at her hands, lying open in her lap. They were blue. The backs of her hands, her fingers, the fine lines of her knuckles, all of it washed in the softest possible blue, the most forgiving light she had ever been seen in, a light that showed everything gently and nothing harshly, a light that seemed to look at the things it illuminated with affection. She became aware, very gradually, that she was smiling, not a decided smile, not a smile she had put on. It had simply arrived on her face, the way warmth had arrived in the air, quietly and without announcement, because the conditions for it existed, and it had come of its own accord to fill them. She felt it in her cheeks and at the corners of her mouth, and most completely somewhere behind her sternum. A warmth there that matched the warmth in the air, as if the lake's light had found an answering light inside her, and the two were acknowledging each other. The blue deepened toward the center, brighter there, still spreading outward from the source, and then gradually, so gradually that she could not have said at what exact moment the shift began. The blue began to change, not disappearing, not replacing itself with something different, but changing the way the sky changes at dawn, not losing one color in order to have another, but adding, layering, becoming richer and more complex. The deep blue was still there, still present, still the foundation and the ground of everything. But rising through it now was silver, not metallic silver, not the silver of surfaces, but the silver of light itself, the silver of moonlight on still water, the silver of stars reflected, the silver of something that does not merely reflect light, but participates in it, contributes its own quality to the overall luminosity. Silver spread through the blue, the way music spreads through a silent room, beginning at one point, and then present everywhere, changing the character of everything it touched without erasing what had been there before. Leora breathed, in and out, still slow, still even, but each breath now carried the light in it. She felt it with each inhalation, entering her not as a foreign substance, but as something familiar, something recognized, something that her body received with the ease and naturalness of receiving air or water or warmth, as if it had always been waiting for exactly this, as if this was, in the most literal sense, what she had been made for. The silver grew, and then, and this was the thing she had seen in the dream always, the thing that came at the end of the dream, just before she woke, the thing she had never been able to hold onto long enough to examine closely, because it always arrived at the threshold of waking and dissolved in the crossing. The silver began to warm, slowly, by degrees, the silver deepening at its edges into something that was not yet gold, but was moving toward gold the way late afternoon light moves toward evening gold, that long golden hour, that particular quality of light that exists only in the time between afternoon and dusk, when the sun is low, and everything it touches becomes briefly more itself, more saturated, more defined, more undeniably present. Gold came into the lake, soft gold, warm gold, the gold of firelight seen through closed hands, the gold of the last sunlight on autumn leaves, the gold of a candle flame in a dark room at the end of a long and honest day. It rose through the silver the way the silver had risen through the blue, adding its layer, contributing its warmth, making the whole more than any one of the parts had been alone. And Leora, sitting at the edge of the lake, with the blanket around her shoulders and her bare feet on the cold grass, and her hands open in her lap, and her face tilted slightly forward toward the water, was held in that light, blue and silver and gold, shifting and layering and breathing. And she felt, with her whole body and her whole heart, and the whole of that quiet, certain, unshakable self that had been believing in this moment for as long as she could remember. She felt completely, entirely, unreservedly at peace, not the temporary peace of a moment's rest between efforts, not the fragile peace of a problem not yet pressing, but the deep peace, the foundational peace, the peace that exists below the level of circumstances and conditions, that does not depend on anything being a particular way, that is simply there, constant and available, when the surface noise is quiet enough to let it be heard. She had not known, until this moment, that this was what she had been looking for. She had thought she was looking for the lake's light. She had thought she was looking for the answer to the village's long, hollow sleeplessness, the solution to the problem of the forgotten dreams. And perhaps she was. Perhaps that was also true, and would also, in time, be given. But what she had found first, what the lake, in its ancient and patient generosity, had offered first, before anything else, before explanations or purposes or plans, was this, simply this, the knowledge, held now not in the mind, but in the body, in the bones, in the breath, the knowledge that beneath everything, beneath all the noise and the effort and the weariness and the accumulated weight of ordinary time, there was this, a light in deep water, a warmth without a source, a peace that asked for nothing except the willingness to sit still long enough to find it. The lake glowed. Leora sat at its edge, held in its light, and did not move, and did not speak, and did not need to do or say or be anything other than exactly what she was, a girl at the edge of still water, breathing, believing, received, and the light continued to rise. Blue and silver and gold, turning slowly in the dark water, spreading outward toward every shore. And somewhere in the reeds, something stirred, not with alarm, not with urgency, but with the slow, deliberate movement of something ancient waking from a very long and necessary sleep. It was coming, and the night held its breath, and the stars leaned in, and everything that had been waiting, the meadow and the reeds and the cold grass and the patient moon, waited one moment longer, and then the water broke. The keeper of the deep fish, there is a moment, and perhaps you have felt it yourself, in the long, quiet hours before sleep, when the body has grown heavy, and the mind has begun its slow drift away from the shore of waking. There is a moment when the boundary between what is real and what is felt becomes very thin, not dissolved, not erased, simply thin, The way the wall between two rooms is thin when both rooms are warm and the door between them stands open, and the same firelight moves through both spaces without distinguishing between them. In that moment, the question of what is real and what is felt becomes less important than it seemed before, because you begin to understand, in the wordless, bodily way that the hours before sleep allow, that felt things are real things, that the warmth you feel in your chest when you remember something beloved is as real as the chair you are sitting in, that the peace that moves through you when you release the day's accumulated weight is as real as the breath that carries it, that the light you see behind your closed eyes, soft and shifting and gold, is real in the way that matters, not real in the way that can be measured or proved, but real in the way that changes you, that leaves something different in you than was there before. Leora was in that moment. She had been in it. She realized for some time, perhaps since she had first sat down at the water's edge, perhaps since the walk through the birchwood, perhaps since before she had left the house, since the moment she had stood at her window with the honey moon before her and known with her whole body that it was time. She had been in that thin-walled, fire-lit, open-doored place between waking and something deeper than waking, and the lake's rising light had not pulled her out of it, but had, instead, deepened it, had taken the thinness of that boundary and made it thinner still, until it was less a wall and more a veil, and less a veil and more the idea of a veil, and then less even than that. The water before her was alive with light, not the simple, sourceless glow of the water's surface reflecting sky. Not that, not anymore. This was light from within, light from below, light that rose through the depth of the water with the slowness and the certainty of something that had always been there and was only now being remembered. The way a word you have forgotten returns to you not in a rush, but in a gradual brightening, the word becoming more present, more available, more itself with each passing moment, until it arrives complete and familiar on the tongue, as if it had never been gone. The blue had settled into its fullness. The silver moved through the blue in slow, irregular patterns, not random, but not deliberate either, the way the grain moves through wood, following some internal logic too complex and too deep to be called a design, but too consistent to be called chaos. And the gold, warm and soft and unhurried, lay over everything the way late evening light lays over a landscape it loves, touching each element with the same quality of attention, finding in each surface something worth illuminating. Leora sat in this light and breathed, and then the water moved. Not all of it, not with violence or with urgency. At the center of the lake, at the exact point from which the light had first emerged, the point of deepest depth, the point furthest from every shore, the surface of the water, which had been still as held breath for the entire duration of her sitting, shifted. It was a barely perceptible shift, a slight convexity at the center, as if something far below had moved upward, and the water above it was responding to that movement, not with turbulence, but with a kind of reluctant and graceful yielding, a making of room. The surface curved upward by perhaps the depth of a fingernail at its highest point, and around that slight central rise, concentric rings spread outward across the glowing water. Not the sharp rings of a dropped stone, but something slower and rounder. Rings that seemed to move not so much through the water as with it, carried rather than cut. The rings reached the shore and met the bank and returned inward, and where the outgoing and returning rings crossed, small points of light brightened briefly and then faded, and the whole surface of the lake became, for a moment, a field of these small brightnesses, a map of intersections, a pattern of encounters, something that looked, if you let your eyes soften and your interpretation loosen, like nothing so much as a language written in water and light, a language without an alphabet, but not without meaning. Leora watched it and did not try to read it. She had learned from the dreams and from old Marin and from all the long hours of interior listening that some things were not meant to be read in the way of words and sentences and transferable information. Some things communicated not through the channel of comprehension, but through the channel of feeling, arriving not as thoughts that could be articulated and repeated, but as states, as qualities, as shifts in the interior, whether that were real and lasting even when they could not be explained. The pattern of intersecting rings on the glowing water was one of those things. She did not understand it. She felt it. And what she felt was welcome. She felt welcomed. Not in the social sense, not in the sense of a door opened and a hand extended and a voice saying, "Come in, come in, we have been expecting you," but welcomed in the deeper sense, welcomed the way a body is welcomed by rest after a long and earnest effort, welcomed the way silence is welcomed by someone who has been in noise too long, welcomed the way the cold ground welcomes rain, not with gratitude or with pleasure exactly, but with a recognition of rightness, a sense of a thing receiving what it was made to receive, a completing of a circuit that had been open and incomplete for longer than was comfortable. She was right to be here. That was the feeling, simple and complete, and not in need of expansion. She was right to be here, at this edge, at this hour, in this particular night that the world had made, and that she had walked into with her blanket, and her old scuffed boots, and her 12 years of dreams, and her grandmother's voice carrying inside her like a lamp. She was right to be here, and the lake knew it, and was saying so in the only language it had, the language of water and light, and the patient, receptive silence of a thing that has been waiting to be found, the convexity at the center of the lake grew, still slow, still without urgency, but growing, the surface rising slightly higher above the general level of the water, and the rising taking on a more defined shape now, the vague general upwelling beginning to gather itself into something more particular, more intentional. The water rose and did not break. It curved upward and held its curve. The surface tension of it stretched, but not exceeded. The light from below shining through the curved water wall and being refracted in it, split into its components, the blue and the silver and the gold showing separately, and then recombining in patterns that had the complexity and the sense of purposefulness of something woven rather than something that simply happened. Leora's breath had slowed to a rate she was not sure she had ever breathed at before, not labored the opposite of labored. Each breath so complete and so unhurried that the interval between one and the next felt not like a pause, but like a fullness, a period of saturation in which her body held all the air and all the warmth and all the light of the moment before releasing it and drawing in the next. She was not trying to breathe this way. Her body had simply found the rhythm that the moment called for. The way a body immersed in still water finds the stillness of the water and becomes still itself, not by effort, but by matching. The rising at the center of the lake reached the surface and passed through it, without breaking, without splashing, without any of the disturbance that objects moving from one medium to another ordinarily produce. It passed through the surface of the water, the way light passes through glass, acknowledging the boundary, bending slightly in the crossing, but not violating it, not forcing it, simply moving through it as if the surface were an agreement that could be honored rather than a barrier that had to be breached. And what emerged was light in the shape of a living thing. Leora looked at it and felt simultaneously two things that should have been contradictory, but were not: profound astonishment and profound familiarity. The astonishment of seeing something she had no adequate prior experience for, no category into which it could be neatly placed, no language sufficient to describe it without leaving out something essential, and the familiarity of the dream, of the recurring dream that had visited her since earliest childhood. The dream she had never been able to hold onto long enough to see clearly. The dream that dissolved in the moment of waking and left only warmth, and the sense of something witnessed that was too large for the waking mind to contain. She was seeing it now, with waking eyes, at the edge of a real lake on a real night. And it was exactly as she had always felt it to be, even when she could not see it. It was exactly itself, the creature, for it was a creature, undeniably, unmistakably, a living and present and intentional being, was large, not frighteningly large, not large in the way of something that overwhelms by size alone, but large in the way of something whose size is precisely right for what it is. The way an old tree is large, the way a mountain seen from the right distance is large, the way certain pieces of music are large, filling the space they occupy completely without excess, without waste, without anything left over, and nothing missing. It had the form of a fish, or more precisely, it had taken on the suggestion of a fish's form, the way a river at a certain speed and angle takes on the suggestion of silk. The form was there, unmistakable and recognizable, but it was not a form composed of ordinary matter, organized in the ordinary way of living things. It was composed of light, or of something so like light that the difference was not practically meaningful. Its body, the long, slow curve of it, the wide sweep of its tail, the broad planes of its sides, was woven from the same three qualities that illuminated the lake: the deep foundation blue, the complex moving silver, and the warm overarching gold. These were not colors applied to a surface. They were the substance itself. The creature was made of these qualities, the way music is made of rhythm and tone and harmony. Each element inseparable from and essential to the whole. Its scales, if scales were the right word, and she was not certain they were, but they were the closest word available, were each of them a small and perfect light, and each light was slightly different from the ones around it, and the differences created the overall pattern of the creature's surface. The way the differences between individual voices create the overall sound of a choir, each one distinct, each one contributing, the whole more complex and more beautiful than any single element could have produced alone. Its eyes were the thing she had seen in the dream. She had never been able to describe them afterward, and now that she was seeing them directly, she understood why. They were not eyes that could be described in the vocabulary of ordinary eyes, not dark or light, not open or closed, not focused on a particular point, or unfocused in the manner of something dreaming. They were eyes that contained rather than reflected, eyes that held. They were the color and the quality of moonlight on still water, which is to say, they were simultaneously the source of the light, and the surface receiving it, and the depth beneath both, all three at once. And they looked at Leora with an expression that she could only inadequately describe as the way it feels to be completely known and completely accepted at the same moment, to be seen, fully seen, and found in the seeing to be enough. The creature floated above the water's surface, not standing on it, not breaking it, but hovering above it by some small distance that varied slightly as it moved, that slight variation giving the movement a quality of breathing, of rise and fall, as if the air beneath it were as responsive to its presence as water was. It was not still. It moved continuously, with the slow, complete, deeply graceful movement of something that has never known urgency. A movement that was less like the movement of a creature navigating a space, and more like the movement of the space itself, the lake and the air and the night reorganizing themselves slightly around the creature's presence, making room not by displacement, but by expansion. Leora did not move. She was not frozen. There was nothing fearful in her stillness. She was simply so completely present, so completely given over to the experience of this moment, that movement would have been not frightening, but irrelevant. She was, in the most complete sense she had ever experienced, exactly where she was. And where she was here, and here was, for this moment, and perhaps for all the moments she would live after it, enough. The creature turned toward her. It did not startle. It did not approach suddenly or with emphasis. It simply oriented, the way a sunflower orients toward light, with the unhurried inevitability of a thing responding to something it was made to respond to. The broad, glowing face turned, and the moonwater eyes found her, and she felt the finding as a warmth that moved from her face downward through her throat and chest, and settled in the belly with the settled quality of something come home after a long journey. And then it spoke, not with a mouth, not with any organ of sound or any vibration of air. It spoke the way the lake spoke, the way the light spoke, in feeling, in warmth, in a quality of meaning that arrived not at the ears or the mind, but at the chest, at the place behind the sternum, where the most important things were felt before they were understood. What arrived was not words, but she understood it as words, the way you understand a piece of music as a story, even though it contains no sentences, not translating it, but receiving it directly, in the register for which it was intended. You came. 2 words, or the feeling of 2 words, simple, complete, carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. Not surprised, not relieved, acknowledging, the acknowledgement of a thing expected and now arrived, a thing hoped for across a very long time and now present, the acknowledgement of a circle completing itself. We have been waiting for someone who still knew how to be still. Leora felt the truth of this move through her, not confirming something she had known. She had not known this, not exactly, not consciously, but confirming something she had felt, the way a diagnosis confirms a feeling in the body that has been present for some time, without yet having a name. The feeling clicked into place, and in clicking into place, it released something. A small knot of uncertainty she had not known she was carrying. A thin wire of self-doubt wound around the certainty, like a vine around a tree, growing so slowly and so close that it had become almost indistinguishable from the thing it wound around. She had been right. Her believing had not been foolishness or the stubbornness of a child who could not accept reality. It had been perception, accurate perception of something real, something waiting, something that had needed exactly what she had to give, not skill, not knowledge, not power, not anything requiring training or gift or specialness, beyond the simple, available, deeply uncommon capacity to be still and to believe without proof. "What happened to the lake?" she asked. Her voice was very soft, softer than she had expected, not from nerves, but from the naturalness of softness in this place, the way you speak softly in a room where something important is sleeping, not wanting to startle it awake, but wanting to speak nonetheless, wanting the connection of language even in its quietest form. The creature moved, a slow turn, a settling, a shift that was not quite stillness, but was close to it. And what came back to her was not an answer in the way of information delivered from one mind to another. It was more like being shown, like a window opening or a door, and through the opening, not a view of something distant and separate, but an immersion, a becoming part of. She was inside the memory of the lake. She did not lose herself. She was still Leora, still sitting on the cold grass with her blanket around her, and her bare feet and her open hands. But she was also, simultaneously, inside something much larger than herself, inside the accumulated experience of this place, across all the long years of its existence, the way a drop of water is inside an ocean while remaining entirely itself. She felt the village as it had been, the people walking the path through the oaks in the evenings, with easy, unhurried steps, the children running ahead, the old people ambling and talking and arriving at the water's edge, and sitting in the comfortable silence of people who had been coming to this place all their lives and knew exactly what it asked of them and gave it willingly. She felt the dreaming that had risen from those visits, the nightly gift of the lake's stored light, reaching into the sleeping village and finding each person where they lay and giving them what they needed, the precise and particular and unrepeatable gift that only that person at that moment, in that season of their life, required. She felt the change, not as a decision, not as a turning away, not as anything that had been chosen consciously or with intent. She felt it as drift, the slow, incremental, barely perceptible drift of people away from stillness, pulled by the ordinary gravity of busy days and practical concerns, and the entirely human tendency to prioritize the urgent over the important, the visible over the invisible, the measurable over the essential. She felt the visits growing less frequent, and she felt what happened in the lake as the visits grew less frequent. Not anger, not abandonment, not anything that carried a moral charge. Simply a dimming, a gradual, gentle, uncomplaining withdrawal of the light back into the depths. The way a fire withdraws when it is not fed, not extinguishing in a moment, not going out with drama or protest, but burning lower and lower and lower, until finally it was only coals, and then only warmth, and then only the memory of warmth, and then stillness. She felt the lakes, long waiting. This was the thing that moved her most. Not the loss, though the loss was felt genuinely and fully, but the waiting, the quality of it, the patience that was not passive, but alive. Not the patience of something that had given up, but the patience of something that had not ceased to trust, that had simply accepted that the waiting would take as long as it took, and had made of the waiting not a suffering, but a practice, a long practice of continuing to be what it was even without an audience, continuing to hold what it held even without anyone coming to receive it, continuing to exist fully and faithfully as itself, even in the dark. The lake had not hardened. It had not closed. It had not grown bitter or indifferent in the years of its dimness. It had simply waited in the dark, with all of its light stored inside it, patient as a seed in winter, patient as love that has not yet found its way to expression, patient as everything that knows the difference between a delay and an ending. When the dreaming stopped, we grew quiet. The creature communicated, feeling rather than words, image and warmth rather than sentence. The lake is made of dreams. It lives on them. It needs them the way a fire needs air not to begin, but to continue. And when the people stopped coming, stopped being still, stopped dreaming, we had nothing to return to them, because there was nothing being given. But I dream, Leora said softly. I have always dreamed. Yes, something in the quality of that single acknowledgement was like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. You kept the channel open, without knowing you were doing it. Every dream you dreamed beside this water, in this village, every one of them found its way back to us. They were small lights in the dark. They were enough to keep the memory alive. They were enough to keep the waiting from becoming forgetting. Leora felt the weight of this, not as a burden, but as a significance, the way certain moments feel significant, feel weighted with a meaning larger than their visible contents. She had not known. She had simply dreamed, the way she breathed, because it was her nature, because it was what her sleeping self did when the waking self stepped aside. She had not known that those dreams were traveling, finding their way through the dark to a patient waiting light at the center of a sleeping lake. How do we bring it back? She whispered. All of it for everyone. The creature moved, a slow, full, complete movement, a kind of turn that was not evasion, but encompassing, as if it were gathering the answer from the whole of itself before offering it. And what came back to her was at once simpler and more complete than anything she had expected. You already have. She waited, feeling there was more. You came. You walked the path in the dark without certainty of what you would find. You sat at the water's edge and asked for nothing. You let yourself be still completely, genuinely still. And in that stillness, you opened something that had been closed, not by lock or by decision, but simply by the long accumulation of not opening. You came, and you were still, and you believed. And that, exactly that, nothing more and nothing less, was what was needed. Liara looked at the lake, glowing around her in its blue and silver and gold, and she understood. It had not required heroism. It had not required a quest completed, or a sacrifice made, or a magic formula spoken at the right moment, under the right conditions. It had required only what she had given: presence, stillness, and the particular quality of open-handed, unhurrying, genuinely patient faith that was perhaps the rarest and most necessary thing in the world. The light was spreading. Even as she sat there, she could feel it moving outward from the lake, through the water table, through the roots of the reeds and the roots of the meadow grass and the roots of the birches and the roots of the great old oaks, moving through the earth toward the village, unhurried and unstoppable. The way dawn moves across a landscape, not fast, not slow, but inevitable, arriving at every surface with the same quality of gentle, complete, unconditional illumination. The dreams were returning to Samnara. She felt the creature's attention on her, not leaving, not withdrawing, but shifting slightly. The way a teacher's attention shifts when the lesson has been given and received, and the time for teaching has passed into the time for simply being present together in what has been shared. She looked at the moon-water eyes and felt once more that quality of being fully seen and found, in the seeing to be enough, more than enough, exactly right. And the light moved through the roots and the earth and the stone paths of the village, and in the quiet houses of Samnara, in the dark rooms where people lay in their beds, something shifted, something settled, something that had been held at a slight and imperceptible tension for many years released, very gently, all the way down, and the first dream of the new dreaming entered the first sleeping mind like a warm and quiet hand. And that mind, without waking, without knowing, without needing to understand, simply opened and received, and went down deeper into the kind of sleep that restores not just the body, but the soul. It had begun, and Liara sat at the edge of the glowing lake, in the company of the ancient light that had waited so long and so faithfully, and felt the beginning move through her like music, heard from a great and beautiful distance, clear and true and absolutely certain, the light that traveled home Milky Way. There is a particular way that good things travel through the world, not loudly, not with announcement or fanfare, or the kind of dramatic arrival that announces itself in advance and demands to be noticed. Good things, the deepest and most lasting good things, tend to move quietly through channels that are not always visible, by routes that do not always make immediate sense, arriving at their destinations without trumpets, without ceremony, often in the middle of the night when everyone is asleep and the world is not watching, and there is no one to applaud the arrival or record the moment for posterity. A child grows, and the growing happens in the night, in the sleeping hours, in the dark and quiet interior of a body that does its most essential work when the busy conscious self has stepped aside and left it in peace. A wound heals, and the healing is invisible, occurring beneath the surface, in layers too deep and too fine for the eye to follow, each cell doing its small and precise and unremarked work, until one morning you press the place where it hurt and find, with a quiet surprise, that the hurt is gone. A seed germinates in the black earth, and the germination is a long and private process. The softening of the shell, the first tentative extension of the root downward, the first pale reach of the shoot upward toward a light it cannot yet see, but orients toward with perfect and unwavering certainty. And none of it is witnessed, none of it is celebrated, and all of it is essential. This is how the light of Naluma traveled to Samnara, quietly, underground, through channels that were old beyond reckoning, older than the village, older than the people who had built the village, older than any human memory of this place. The water table beneath the meadow and the birchwood, and the oak canopy path held the light the way it held water, invisibly, thoroughly, distributing it through a network so fine and so complex, and so completely interwoven with the root systems of every growing thing that to separate the light from the earth at this point would have been like separating the meaning from a word. They were, by now, the same thing. The earth was full of the light, and the light was full of the earth, and together they moved through the dark, underground the way a river moves, not choosing its path, not deliberating, but following the natural contours of what was there, finding the low places and filling them, finding the passages and moving through them, arriving everywhere it was possible to arrive with the patient, purposeful inevitability of water. Leora was not watching this. She could not have watched it. It was invisible, underground, happening in the dark beneath her feet, while she sat at the lake's edge, with the glowing creature floating above the water before her, and the air around her warm with lake light, and the whole of her being occupied with the experience of the present moment in a way that left no attention over for imagining what was happening elsewhere. She was entirely here. The village was not elsewhere exactly. It was connected to here by the path she had walked and by the roots, and by the light now moving through those roots. But it was out of sight and out of mind, and this was right. This was as it should be. She had done what she had come to do. The rest was the lake's work, and the earth's work, and the long patient work of all the dreaming she had done across the years of her life, without knowing she was doing anything except sleeping What she was watching was the creature. It had settled, not descended back into the water, but settled into a quality of stillness that was different from its earlier movement, different in the way that a person sitting in a comfortable chair by a fire is different from a person in motion, but not less present, not less alive. It floated above the water with a stillness that felt inhabited, considered, chosen, the stillness of something that has said what it came to say, and is now content to simply be. In the company of the person it came to say it to, without needing anything more from the encounter than the encounter itself. Leora was content in exactly the same way. She was not waiting for more. She was not preparing a next question or cataloging what she had been told or trying to organize the experience into a form she could carry back to waking life and report accurately. She was simply sitting in the light and the warmth and the extraordinary quality of presence that the creature and the lake together created, and allowing herself to be in it, fully in it, without reservation or management or the subtle holding back that is the mind's habitual protection against experiences too large for it to control. This was, she understood, the actual gift, not the story she had been shown, not the explanation of what had happened to the lake, or the understanding of what had been needed, or even the knowledge that the light was now traveling toward the village through the dark earth. Those were all true and all real, and all would matter in the days and years ahead. But they were not the deepest thing being offered. The deepest thing being offered was this: the experience of being without agenda, in the presence of something ancient and luminous and entirely patient and entirely kind. The experience of being received, not for what she had done, or what she knew, or what she was going to do, but simply for being here, at this edge, in this night, exactly as she was. She thought of old Marin. She did not know why the thought arrived at this particular moment. Or rather, she knew, in the indirect way that you know things in the hours before sleep, when the connections between things are more visible than they are in daylight. She knew because old Marin had given her, across all the years of her life, exactly this quality of presence, had sat with her at the fireside and received her dreams and her questions and her certainties and her confusions with exactly this quality of unhurrying, undemanding, completely present attention, had looked at her across the kitchen table and across the years with something in her eyes that was Leora understood now, sitting in the lake's light, for the first time with full clarity, a reflection of this, a human-sized reflection of this ancient and luminous patience, as if old Marin had once, long ago, sat at this same water's edge and received what was being offered and had carried it back with her to the village and had been distributing it ever since in the currency available to her, in attention, in stillness, in the quality of her listening, in the way she said the word rest as if it were sacred, which it was. The light in the lake shifted. It did not dim, nothing about it diminished, but it changed quality slightly, the way the light in a room changes when a cloud moves across the sun outside. The same warmth present, the same fundamental illumination, but the quality of it more interior, more concentrated, less spread across the surface, and more gathered into the depth. The blue deepened. The silver quieted to a shimmer rather than a movement. The gold settled into itself like embers settling in a fire that has passed its peak brightness and is now at its most sustainable and most lasting warmth. Less spectacular than the open flame, more durable, more reliable, more genuinely comforting. The creature moved, a single slow motion, a turn, a settling, a realignment that brought its great glowing face to bear on the space between itself and the shore, between itself and Leora. And in that alignment, something passed between them that was not communication exactly, not the giving and receiving of specific content, but something more like a handing over, a passing of something from one set of hands to another, not a weight, or not only a weight, but a responsibility, which is different from a burden in the same way that a gift is different from an obligation. Both require something of you, but one requires it with love and the other with demand. And the requiring with love is, in the end, not a diminishment of the self, but an expansion of it. She was being trusted with something. She felt this clearly, without needing to name what the something was. She was being trusted with the knowledge of what she had found here, and what it meant, and what it asked of her, not in the way of a mission or a calling, or a dramatic purpose that would reorganize her life around a single point. Nothing so grand or so externally visible as that. What she was being trusted with was simpler and more demanding than any mission. The ongoing practice of what she had demonstrated tonight. The practice of stillness. The practice of believing without proof. The practice of making the walk to the water, not necessarily this water, not necessarily literally, but the interior equivalent of this walk, the turning away from noise toward quiet, from urgency toward patience, from the accumulated weight of doing toward the restorative practice of simply being, and making it regularly, not as a heroic act, but as an ordinary one, the way breathing is ordinary, the way drinking water is ordinary, because it is necessary, and because, without it, something essential slowly dims. She nodded, not to the creature, not as a formal acceptance of a formal charge. She nodded the way you nod when something you already knew has been said aloud in exactly the right words. The nod of recognition, of already known now confirmed, of yes, of course, of I will because I already am and have always been. The creature held her gaze for a moment longer, and then it began, slowly and without haste, to descend. Not sinking, that was not the word, and the distinction mattered. It did not sink the way a heavy thing sinks, pulled by gravity into a medium that offers resistance. It descended the way light descends into water, moving through the boundary between air and lake with the same graceful acknowledgement of transition that it had shown in emerging, bending at the crossing, honoring the distinction between above and below, while demonstrating that the distinction was, for it, navigable. It descended, and the water received it and closed over it, and the surface, for a moment, held the impression of its presence, the way a pillow holds the impression of a head after a long and restful night. And then that too smoothed away, and the lake's surface was unbroken again. But the light remained, blue and silver and gold, moving in its slow and complex patterns beneath the surface, deeper now, more settled, less a new arrival, and more an established presence. The presence of something that had returned to where it belonged after a long absence, and was reacquainting itself with the familiar contours of home. The light did not require the creature's surface presence to continue. It had its own momentum now, its own life, its own reasons for being. It would burn through the night, and through the days, and through the nights that followed, tended now not by the creature alone, but by the dreaming of an entire village slowly returning to itself. Leora turned her face from the water and looked up. The sky above her was the sky she had always known. The same stars in their same positions, the same moon now lower and warmer in the west, the same vast and patient dark that had held the world every night of her entire life. But it looked different to her now, and she knew the difference was not in the sky, but in herself, in the quality of seeing she was bringing to it, a seeing that had been altered by the night's experience in a way she could not yet fully describe, but could fully feel. It was as if a layer of something, not dirt, not obstruction exactly, but a kind of opacity that accumulates on the inside of the eyes from long exposure to surfaces that do not give back what they receive, had been very gently, very thoroughly cleaned away. And what she was looking at now was not the sky as she usually saw it, but the sky as it actually was, enormous and detailed and trembling with presence. Every star a fact, and every fact an astonishment. The whole of it so completely and so obviously alive that she could not understand how she had ever looked at it without feeling this. She breathed. Somewhere behind her, in the village, the light was arriving. She knew this not because she could see it or hear it, but because she could feel it. A subtle shift in the quality of the night. The way you can feel a change in weather before it arrives, in the pressure of the air, in a certain quality of heightened expectancy in the atmosphere. The night felt fuller than it had when she arrived, more inhabited, more warm, less like an empty space waiting to be filled, and more like a room already full of the kind of warmth that accumulates when many people sleep quietly in the same place, and their breathing mingles and their dreams rise together, and the air between them becomes saturated with the evidence of their being alive, together, resting. She thought of her parents in their bed, their faces smooth in sleep, the slight furrow between her mother's brows that appeared in waking hours and disappeared in sleep finally. Finally, tonight, releasing entirely, her mother's face going soft and young and completely unheld. She thought of her father, whose large hands lay always slightly curled even in sleep, as if still holding the tools of his daily work, those hands opening now. She imagined the fingers releasing, the palms turning upward in the unconscious gesture of someone who has put down what they were carrying and is resting, truly resting, for the first time in a long time. She thought of Tio, her small brother, who slept with the complete and unconscious totality of very young children, arms flung wide, mouth slightly open, everything given over with the absolute trust of a person who has not yet learned that there is anything worth protecting against. Tio already dreamed in the simple and vivid way of young children, and his dreams had always been rich and strange, and full of animals and adventures that he would recount at breakfast with breathless enthusiasm. But tonight, she thought, his dreams would be different, deeper, more lit, carrying something the lake was adding to what was already naturally his. The way a river carries what the tributaries contribute to it, richer for each addition. She thought of old Marin last. Old Marin, who had been a girl when the lake shone, and who had carried the memory of its shining through all the long years of its darkness, and had given that memory to Leora with the same care and deliberateness that you give something irreplaceable, not clutching it, not keeping it for yourself, but passing it on with open hands, and the trust that the person receiving it will know what it is worth. What was old Marin dreaming tonight? Leora closed her eyes and let herself imagine it, and the imagining came easily, warmly, with the effortlessness of a thing that the heart already knows, and is simply allowing the mind to articulate. She imagined old Marin in her narrow bed, with the patchwork quilt pulled to her chin, and her white hair loose on the pillow, her face, always so expressive in waking, so animated by the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, finally released into sleep's simplicity, and in the sleep, a dream arriving the way old familiar music arrives when you hear it again, after a long absence, recognized before you know you are recognizing it, loved before you have consciously remembered loving it, the dream of the lake as it had been, not as a loss, not as a thing recovered from distance, but as a present, immediate living reality, the lake glowing as she had seen it as a girl, as she had described it to Leora 100 times by firelight. The blue and the silver and the gold moving in the water while she stood at its edge as a small child with her grandmother's hand in hers, and the whole warm night around her, and the light coming up through the soles of her feet and filling her from the ground upward until she was, for that moment, and for all the moments that followed it, lit. Leora felt tears on her face. She noticed them without alarm, without any impulse to wipe them away. They were not sad tears, or not only sad, and not primarily sad. They were the tears that come when something long hoped for is finally given, when the waiting that has been patient through all its length is finally, gently, completely rewarded. They were the tears of a fullness that has no other way out. She let them fall, and they fell onto her hands, and onto the blanket, and onto the grass below her, and perhaps, she thought, they fell all the way down into the earth and joined the light moving through the roots toward home. The night had grown later. The moon was lower still, touching now the tops of the trees on the western shore of the lake, its light horizontal and very warm, the deep amber of a moon near setting. The stars directly above her were the brightest stars, the ones that reign in the deepest part of the night, when the competition of the moon's full brilliance has diminished. And each star can be what it actually is, not a point in a field, but a presence, a fact, a fire at an incomprehensible distance, burning with a patience that made even the lake's long waiting seem brief by comparison. She thought about patience. She had been thinking, in one way or another, about patience all her life, shaped by old Marin's example of it, shaped by the experience of her own interior waiting, shaped by the recurring dream that had come back and back and back across all the years of her childhood with the faithful, unhurrying consistency of the tide. But she understood patience differently now than she had at the beginning of this night. Before, she had understood it as a quality, a virtue, perhaps, or a disposition, something some people had more naturally than others, and that could be cultivated with effort and intention. Something admirable, something worth practicing. Now she understood it as something more fundamental than that. Patience, she understood now, was not a quality layered onto the self from outside. It was not a behavior chosen and maintained by effort. At its deepest level, at the level the lake had shown her, at the level the creature had demonstrated in its every movement and quality of presence, patience was a form of faith, a form of trust so complete that the question of timing had ceased to create anxiety, because the arrival of the thing trusted was not in doubt. And things not in doubt do not require management, only receptivity. The lake had been patient because it had never stopped trusting. It had dimmed, yes. It had grown quiet, yes. It had waited in the dark for for a very long time without the visits and the dreaming that fed it. But it had not closed. It had not hardened or contracted or turned away. It had remained throughout the long dark years, entirely itself, entirely open, entirely available, entirely willing. Because its patience was not the patience of waiting to see if something might happen, but the patience of knowing that it would, and resting in that knowing. She wanted to carry this back with her, not as an idea, not as a concept she had encountered and found interesting and would try to remember. She wanted to carry it the way she carried old Marin's words, in the body, in the breath, in the place below articulation, where things that matter are stored and do their work without requiring the constant attention of the conscious mind. She wanted it to be part of her, the way the lake's light was part of the night now. Not always visible from every angle, but present, underlying, fundamental. The light on the water pulsed once, gently, warmly. A single, slow, full brightening, like a deep breath taken and released, that sent gold rippling outward to every shore, and then settled back into its steady, patient glow. It was not a signal, not exactly. It was more like an acknowledgement, like the moment at the end of a long and honest conversation, when both people fall into a silence that is not empty, but full of everything that has been said and understood and shared, full of the warmth of having been genuinely in each other's presence, full of the particular quality of quiet that follows real communication. The night had given what it came to give. Leora had received what she came to receive. And something else, something she could not have named or predicted at the beginning of this night, had been given too. Something between the lake and herself that had no name in the language available to her, that existed in the category of things known completely and described only partially, things that live most fully in the space between words and make their home there deliberately, because language, for all its beauty and precision, is always a little smaller than the things it is trying to hold. She was very tired. She noticed this with a kind of grateful recognition, the tiredness of genuine expenditure, of a self that has been fully used and is now requesting return. Not the hollow tiredness of the sleepless nights the village had been living through. The tiredness that was not really tiredness, but a kind of wearing down, a friction without traction. This was the clean, complete, deeply satisfying tiredness of a body and a heart that have done exactly what they came to do, and are now ready, genuinely, wholly, without reservation, to rest. She lay down. It was not a decision, exactly. Her body made the movement, and she followed it, the way you follow the water when it carries you. She curled onto her side in the cold grass, drawing her blanket around her, her cheek against the earth. The grass beneath her was damp with dew and cool and fine, and the earth below it was solid and patient and entirely indifferent to her presence in the best possible way. way the earth is indifferent, holding everything equally, asking nothing of anything it holds. She looked at the lake from this new angle, from the height of the grass, with her cheek on the ground. The lake's surface was at eye level, and the light in it was therefore not above her or below her, but level with her gaze. And the effect was extraordinary, as if the lake and she were the same thing, as if the distinction between the water and the air and the earth and the person lying in the grass at the edge of all of it was a distinction of degree and not of kind. She was, she felt, of a piece with it, part of the same night, the same ground, the same patient and light-filled moment. She looked at the moon. It had reached the tree line and was resting there, balanced on the tips of the western birches, its light coming entirely sideways now, amber and warm and very close. So close it seemed she could reach out and put her hand in it, the way you put your hand in a warm stream. The moon looked back at her with the expression it always had, round and patient and utterly, absolutely kind. The expression of something that has been watching the world for a very long time and has found, in all that watching, no reason to withdraw its light. You can rest now, everything said, not in words, in the weight of her limbs, growing heavier with each breath, in the warmth of the blanket around her, the familiar weight of it settling into her body's contours, in the soft constancy of the lake's glow at the edge of her vision, not demanding to be looked at, not asking to be anything more than it was, simply present, simply shining, simply there. There is nothing left to do tonight. Her eyes were growing heavy. She did not resist this. There was nothing in her that wanted to resist it. No anxiety about sleeping here, outdoors, at the water's edge. No sense that she ought to return to the house before allowing herself to go down into the dark. The earth was holding her. The lake was watching over her. The night was complete and benign and entirely safe, and her body knew all of this and was releasing the last of its held tension in long, slow, grateful waves. The world is safe. The night is good. Her breathing slowed to the breathing of sleep, or something very close to it, that long, deep, rhythmic breathing that is the body's own lullaby, the sound it makes when the self has truly let go, when nothing is being held or managed or maintained except the simple, automatic, endlessly faithful work of being alive. Let yourself fall, the night said, slowly, gently, all the way down. The lake glowed. The moon rested on the birches. The stars turned their slow, eternal turning. And Leora, lying in the cold, sweet grass at the edge of Naluma, with her blanket around her and the earth beneath her, and the whole warm night above her, closed her eyes and fell slowly, gently, completely into the deepest and most held and most luminous sleep of her life. And in Samnara, the dreams were already there. In every house, in every room, in every sleeping mind, the light had arrived, and the arriving was complete, and the village that had forgotten how to dream was remembering, in the only way that remembering truly happens, not by thinking, but by receiving, not by effort, but by rest, not by trying, but by letting go and falling, and being caught by something older and more patient and more constant than anything the waking world could offer. The light held them all, every one, the morning after, forever star. There is a particular quality to the light of a morning that follows something important. Not every morning has it. Most mornings arrive in the ordinary way, perfectly good, perfectly serviceable, carrying the usual mixture of promise and obligation, the usual quality of a page turned, and a new day beginning with whatever the day before left unfinished, and whatever this day has been quietly preparing to offer. Most mornings are fine mornings, honest mornings, mornings that ask nothing exceptional of you and offer nothing exceptional in return. And this is not a failing, but a faithfulness, the faithfulness of ordinary time doing its ordinary work with ordinary dignity. But some mornings are different. Some mornings arrive carrying something extra, something that has no precise name in the vocabulary of weather or season or time of year, because it is not those things that produce it. It is produced by what happened the night before, not in any simple cause and effect relationship, not as a mechanical consequence, but in the way that a room is changed by a conversation that took place in it, or a person is changed by a dream they have not yet fully remembered, or a field is changed by rain that fell in the night. The change is real. The change is complete, but it arrived invisibly and cannot be pointed to and cannot be fully explained, only felt in the quality of the air, in the way the light lands on familiar surfaces, in a sense of things being simultaneously the same as they always were, and somehow, inexplicably, more themselves. The morning that rose over Samnara on the day after Leora walked to the lake was exactly this kind of morning. It came slowly, the way the best mornings always do, not switching on, not announcing itself with any abruptness, but arriving by degrees, the way the lake's light had arrived the night before. First, a softening of the darkness in the east, barely perceptible, the deep blue-black of the deepest part of the night beginning to acknowledge, at its furthest edge, the approach of something different, then a deepening of that softening into something that could genuinely be called color, a blue so deep and so clear it was almost purple, layered with a translucency that ordinary daylight blue did not have, a blue that existed only in this transition moment and nowhere else in the day's palette, a blue that was the sky's version of the state between waking and sleep, then the first pale gold at the horizon. It appeared as it always appeared, as it had appeared every morning since the first morning over this particular hill, and this particular valley, and this particular cluster of stone houses in their particular hollow of the world, without drama, without force, without any quality of imposition. It was simply there, suddenly, and then increasingly, a warm brightness at the place where the earth curved away and the sky began, spreading upward with a patience and a certainty so complete it required no hurry. The birds knew before the light was visible. They always did. The first bird, always a single voice, always the bravest or the most awake or simply the most compelled, began before the sky showed any color at all, singing into the dark with a confidence that was either extraordinary faith or the simple expression of a creature that knew, in its bones and in its blood, that the light was coming because it had always come, and there was no reason in the world to doubt that it would come again. This morning, that first bird's song sounded different to the sleeping ears of Samnara. Not louder, not more elaborate. The song itself was exactly what it always was, the particular sequence of notes that belonged to that particular bird, as individual and as consistent as a signature. But it entered the dreams of the sleeping villagers, not as an interruption, not as the signal to begin the process of surfacing, of reassembling the waking self from its scattered sleeping parts, but as a continuation, as if the dream and the bird song were the same country, different territories of the same inhabited landscape, and the transition between them was not a border crossing, but a change of room. This was new. The people of Samnara had not woken this way in more years than most of them could count. They had woken for all those years, as people wake from hollow sleep, suddenly, with a small internal jolt, the way you come up out of deep water. From nothing to something, from absence to presence, the gap between sleep and waking crossed in an instant that felt more like a rupture than a transition. They had woken tired most mornings. They had woken with the particular tiredness that follows sleep, that did not restore, the tiredness of a lamp whose oil was not replenished in the night, and which has been burning on the residue of what it had before. This morning was not that. This morning they rose, not all at once, not in the same moment, but one by one across the village in the slow, overlapping way of a community waking, each person at their own pace and in their own time. They rose as people rise from genuinely deep and genuinely nourishing sleep, gradually, with a quality of reluctance that was not unhappy, but was the reluctance of someone leaving somewhere good, somewhere they had been entirely welcome and entirely at ease, the reluctance of a person who would happily have stayed a little longer in the warm country of the dream, not because waking was unwelcome, but because the dream had been so genuinely, unexpectedly, movingly good. They remembered, not everything. Dreams are shy about being remembered. They dissolve in the light the way morning mist dissolves, which is to say completely and without residue, leaving only the memory of having been there, the warmth they produced, the particular quality of changed air that follows their passing. What the people of Samnara remembered of their dreams this morning was not the content. For the most part, not the specific landscapes and figures and events and conversations. What they remembered was the feeling, and the feeling was extraordinary. Old Marin woke first, as she always did, old bodies keeping old hours, the biological clock of a long life ticking with the faithful insistence of something fully wound. She woke in her narrow bed with the patchwork quilt pulled to her chin, and the window beside her showing the first pale gold of the horizon. And she lay completely still for a long moment, looking at the ceiling, which was the same ceiling she had looked at from this bed for more years than she cared to count. The same familiar map of small cracks and plaster variations that she could have drawn from memory with her eyes closed. The ceiling was the same, and yet she was not the same person who had looked at it yesterday morning. She knew this the way you know things that happen in the night, not through a process of reasoning, but through simple, direct, bodily knowledge. Something in her had shifted while she slept. Some long-held tension, so long held that she had stopped experiencing it as tension, and had simply incorporated it into her sense of what normal felt like, had released, and in its releasing had revealed what had been beneath it all along. A warmth, a lightness, a quality of interior ease that she recognized, with a start of emotion so strong it made her close her eyes and press her lips together, from long ago, from childhood, from the mornings after the lake had shone. She lay very still with her eyes closed and let herself feel it, all of it, without hurrying toward explanation or analysis, without immediately beginning to process what it meant, or what had happened, or what should be done next. She simply let herself be in the feeling the way the village had once been in the lake's light, openly, completely, without reservation. She had dreamed of her grandmother. The specific content of the dream had dissolved, as dreams do. But what remained was the quality of her grandmother's presence. That particular warmth, that particular quality of being entirely seen and entirely loved, that particular sense of the world being fundamentally all right, that very old and very wise people sometimes carry with them and distribute, without knowing they are doing so, to everyone in their vicinity. She had felt in the dream her grandmother's hand, the specific texture of it, the papery warmth of very old skin, the particular way those fingers had curved around hers, with a grip that was gentle but entirely certain.